In the dark prisoners' barracks, the unbearable cold once again reigned supreme. The decrepit wooden bunk beds stacked in threes, filled with ill, half-dead prisoners who, drained of energy, had passed out till morning, despite the awful stench and ubiquitous ice. The Oswensum concentration camp was submerged in night, and tomorrow, hell awaited the prisoners. Tadeusz Sobowitz, a young lad who nowadays would be considered a teenager, carried out heavy labor every day without pause for the good of the right. The prisoners had no other choice and weren't even considered to have human rights. When one of the SS officers approached, you always had to take off your striped cap and look straight at the sky. A strange rule, but any slip-up could mean death, so questions seemed unnecessary. Tadeusz was all of 14 years when the world was shaken by the Second World War. The lad was born in the Polish town of Poznan, and since his childhood had dreamed of becoming an actor, but his childhood dreams were shattered by the terrors of war. Tadeusz's father was a military officer and knew well enough what awaited his family. He made them get out of town and head for Warsaw for safety. But Tadeusz couldn't stay there. He loved his homeland and in 1941 decided to join forces with the Polish resistance movement, where he served as a liaison officer. There, he had to live in a basement and act under a different name, although such conspiracy didn't save him. On September 1, 1941, Tadeusz Sobowitz was arrested by the Gestapo. They put him in the Zawodzice prison to extract information from him about the Polish militia. Sitting in interrogation, half beaten to death, Tadeusz understood that he was probably betrayed by his own comrades in arms. But the youngster didn't say a single word about the militia. As was explained later, it actually was betrayal. He spent little time in his Zawodzice prison cell. They chased him out onto the street with Jewish people, threw them into a railway carriage and drove them off somewhere. Many would prefer death to the fate that awaited Tadeusz and millions of other military prisoners. On November 20, 1941, he was unloaded from the carriage together with a crowd of his equally unlucky compatriots, as if they were just dusty sacks. In front of them towered walls with barbed wire, towers with German machine guns and tall gates. The inscription on the gates read, "Work sets you free." This phrase became the unique symbol of one of the Nazi concentration camps, Auschwitz. The officer, Karl Fritz, came out to the crowding captives. Tadeusz remembered his name for the rest of his life. The officer solemnly announced there was only one way out of Auschwitz, through the chimneys of the crematorium. Then Tadeusz understood that in this place work frees you only posthumously. Tadeusz lost count of the days he spent in Auschwitz. It was a terrifying place. Its description could make you go mad. The laws of human decency simply weren't at play there. They were distorted and perverted by Nazi dogma. Auschwitz seemed like hell on earth, and it was hard for Tadeusz to recognize that the place actually existed. But no time or strength could be spared for contemplation. Each day, they squeezed all they could from the prisoners, saddling them with work. Upon his arrival, Tadeusz received a striped uniform and a red triangle badge, which signified Tadeusz was a political prisoner. He was assigned the prison number 23053. This number was not only stitched onto his uniform, they'd imprinted it on his skin with a special method. They branded people like animals. Since Tadeusz was a strong young lad, he avoided the gas chamber. He was sent to work in labor brigades. Each of his days became an exhausting routine, and usual work on a building site or a production line was considered lucky. Their strange task was removing corpses, the endless flood of corpses, and what remained of them after their execution. Driving his shovel into the frozen earth, Tadeusz looked at the crematorium's high chimneys. Day and night without stop, over all these horrible years, thick black smoke had streamed from their chimneys. When especially large groups came into the crematoriums, a flame would break out of the chimneys as if from the bowels of hell, sometimes up to 3 meters tall. Catching his breath for several seconds, Tadeusz again began digging. It was the next hole for bodies. The ovens of the crematoriums could no longer cope with the load. Beside him, a few dozen meters from the camp, a small gloomy lake was frozen solid. Ash from the crematoriums was scattered there. Later, when the war would become a thing of the past and Auschwitz a memorial site, the place would be considered the largest mass grave on Earth. Of course, like everyone else, Thaddeus dreamed of escape, but soon all these thoughts disappeared and escape seemed impossible. In Auschwitz, there were plenty of ways to die. The quickest of them was to die by the Black Wall between blocks 10 and 11, where they executed wrongdoers. Thaddeus, like many others, would cover his ears every time, so not to hear this terror. But the majority of prisoners died in the gas chambers, where troublemakers and those simply without the strength to work also ended up. People wasted away there very quickly, sometimes literally after several weeks. They were so weak and ill that they couldn't even move. Other prisoners had to stack them on top of each other like wood. Thaddeus remained in Auschwitz till March 10, 1943. Then they sent him to a different camp, then another one. Thaddeus Sobowolitz was a prisoner of 6 camps: Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Leipzig, Mulesen, Flossenburg, and Regensburg. And everywhere he dreamed only of one thing: simple survival, holding on to the very end. But in Mulesen, death practically made a grab at him. May 1st, 1944. This night was special for the prisoners. Many of them didn't sleep, but only pretended to, so they could trick the guards. This night, every prisoner, and there were nearly 1,000 of them, would get the chance for freedom. The Soviet prisoners, who were the majority there, had prepared an escape plan, similar to the one from Sobibor. Thaddeus also knew about the plan. More than once he had heard about these mass escapes, but had no intention of taking part in it. Having passed through so many concentration camps, Auschwitz especially, Thaddeus knew that such a plan was almost suicidal. He had endured too much to throw his life away now. At some point, the underground rooms in the camp, which were located under the weapons factory, started to fill with an acrid smoke. This meant that the escape had started. The military prisoners had set alight their wooden bunk beds they slept on in order to distract the guards and take refuge in the smoke. No one was asleep now. They sounded the alarm, and Thaddeus, terrified, waited for the night to end. The SS soldiers went down into the underground rooms and opened fire on everyone they saw. Machine gun fire took even the lives of those who had nothing to do with the escape. A real battle began, and the escape was soon suppressed, but the executions continued. Thaddeus found himself in a desperate position between the Nazis' machine guns and the fire, which now filled the space around him. Only thanks to miraculous luck did Thaddeus survive. He suffered from third-degree burns and smoke inhalation, but didn't number among those whom this night had been their last. The dead numbered nearly 200. The camp became unsuitable for work. All who had survived were immediately thrown into trucks and driven for 5 hours straight without stopping. Thaddeus came to be in Flossenburg, where together with other wounded prisoners, he received treatment for his burns in the camp hospital. Thaddeus' last camp was Regensburg. The war's climax drew close, and the situation was extremely tense. This camp didn't resemble factories of death like Auschwitz or Buchenwald. The Nazis rushed about. Little of their former confidence in their superiority remained. The Soviets drew even closer. The German towns were regularly subjected to air raids. In the early morning, prisoners were made to clear the debris from bombs and filled craters that had formed with soil. At night, all the prisoners were gathered in a ballroom called the Colosseum, where they slept on the floor. In Regensburg, Thaddeus worked in an open-floor kitchen. Here, the main threats were not strict supervisors. In fact, it was far more worse. The life of the prisoners often hung by a thread when the town was subjected to Soviet attacks. On the night of April 22, 1945, SS officers burst into the Colosseum where the soldiers were sleeping. Without hesitation, Thaddeus carries out their order and forms ranks with everyone else. The Nazis are agitated as never before. They're shouting. They're losing their patience with the prisoners. Thaddeus hears an unusual order. They are to immediately abandon Regensburg. Chaos ensued. Thaddeus stood in line and all the prisoners started to follow the Nazis at a run. It goes without saying that the supervisors traveled on light transport at the head and rear of the column. Very soon, Thaddeus heard shots somewhere from behind him. It wasn't difficult to guess that the Nazis were killing those who were unable to run. By morning, there was still hope that some transport would pick them up, but the march on foot continued again. And by the afternoon, it had already become clear that there would be no such transport. The whole column of 500 military prisoners ran on without pause. Even a healthy person full of vitality couldn't have steadily endured just 3 days of that sort of running. The Germans called this a death march. Thaddeus was strong. but the conditions became unbearable. They were barely allowed to sleep and very rarely allowed water and food while they marched. By the fourth day, only half remained alive. On the sixth day, only 100 people continued the march. The Nazis also reduced their convoy, so several prisoners had already managed to escape and survive. This was the chance for Thaddeus and the remaining prisoners. Rumors surfaced that Hitler had shot himself and that the Soviets had already taken Germany. The Nazis started panicking more, which the prisoners also took advantage of. On the 9th day of the death march, Thaddeus and several of his comrades figured out how to escape. The escapees hid in a farming village. And 2 days later, on March 2, 1945, Thaddeus finally got his freedom. The Soviet forces rescued the escapees. Thaddeus Sobolewicz fell into captivity as a 16-year-old youth and experienced a kind of terror that the majority of people now will not encounter through the entirety of their lives. After the war, he returned to his mother in Poland, who had survived the war. Thaddeus' father had died in Auschwitz. Despite all the depravity and difficulties he had endured, the Polish lad was able to return to a normal life and fulfill his former dream. Thaddeus Sobolewicz became world famous as an actor on stage and screen. In the film Triumph of the Spirit, he even played the role of an SS officer. As well as that, Thaddeus wrote several memoirs and a book called But I Survived, where he told the story of his own experience in the camps. Despite the painful memories, Thaddeus Sobolewicz often led tours to Auschwitz for students from universities and schools. With all his heart, he wanted future generations to never recreate these factories of death. Thaddeus Sobolewicz passed away on October 28, 2015, but his story continues to live on. Leave this video a like and subscribe to our channel. There's still lots more interesting stuff to come.